Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and welcome. It's my pleasure to chair this seminar today and to introduce Deanna, so Deanna Lyncook. So just a short intro. So Deanna Lyncook is a PhD history student at Queen Mary, University of London. Her research takes a transnational approach to the experiences of Caribbean children in the British education system in Britain and its Caribbean colonies in the second half of the 20th century. It explores the migration experiences of Caribbean children through oral history. She's also the founder of the podcast, The History Hotline, where she has discussed events and individuals that has shaped Black history in Britain and the Caribbean. Deanna has worked in public history and heritage spaces as an oral history and project officer at the Museum of Methodism, curating an exhibition on Black and Asian leaders in British Methodism. She has also worked on historical research projects for the Society for Caribbean Studies, the University of Leeds, SOAS, BBC Radio London, and the Times Radio. She's also co-organised the Issue of Truth, a Black British History Conference funded by the IHR and Northwestern University with Olivia Wyatt. So welcome, Deanna. I'd also, as Deanna is in St. Kitts, just a reminder to everybody once she starts her presentation, if you could please switch off your video and remember to keep it on mute. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. I'll have a Q&A. You can either raise your hand and ask the question yourself or type it in the chat and I will ask the question for you. So yeah, we're all looking forward to your presentation, Deanna. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sabrina, for chairing this and Eve for organising this talk and the wider Caribbean seminar series. I am live in St. Kitts, and up until about 12 o'clock here, there was construction outside. I have a feeling they've stopped for lunch, so we might actually get a window of an hour of this presentation where there is no construction. But apologies if it does get loud, just please maybe put it in the chat and I can, say something again or pause. But as Sabrina said, I'm Deanna Lyncook, a PhD student at Queen Mary, and I work on transnational histories of education across the former British Caribbean colonies and Britain. I'm going to share my screen to share my presentation. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. If not, please let me know. Brilliant. Thank you, Eve. Thanks, Sabrina. Okay, so my paper title today is Many See the Problem, Only Someone Changes, the Change in Philosophy of Education in 20th Century Jamaica. So I'm going to be talking through education policy in Jamaica primarily. I wanted to start actually by talking a little bit about my podcast, which is a kind of another side to my historical work. And I'm doing it at the beginning because I always forget to talk about it at the end. And then I realize I go away and I haven't actually said about my podcast. So the History Hotline was born out of frustration in part at the lack of publicly accessible history on Black Britain and the Caribbean outside of academia. Following the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, it was clear to me that there was an appetite for some of these often underserved and under-researched histories. And so the kind of increased demand for it in a simple and accessible format pushed me to launch in 2020 in August of that year. The first episode was on the Mangrove 9, which coincided with the trailer release for Steve McQueen's CLACS series on the BBC. One of the episodes is about education. And so that kind of ties in, I guess. After 150 episodes, the podcast is on a hiatus because I need to finish my PhD and doing the two at once is quite difficult and challenging. But it has covered histories of events, individuals, organizations, and as well as terminology and literature relating to the Caribbean, Caribbean history, culture, the food, language, and some African history, but primarily Black British history overall. So if you do want to tune into that, then please feel free. So on to my work. So my paper explores the migration experience. Sorry, my paper explores the education system in the Caribbean, but my wider thesis explores the migration experiences of Caribbean children from Jamaica and St. Kitts and Nevis through the lens of the British colonial education system in the Caribbean and then through to Britain as they migrate. And the paper obviously today will be taken from this wider work. I will say the ideas I'm kind of thinking through and talking through today are kind of under construction in my brain a little bit still. So I really will welcome, questions, thoughts, comments on the kind of arguments and the kind of points I'm drawing on within this paper. I wanted to give a little bit more context to my thesis. It's, as Sabrina said, an oral history, and I look at children migrating from Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis to Birmingham in particular in the post-war era. It aims to complicate the somewhat oversimplified so-called Windrush narratives, which initially focused on the lived experiences of ex-servicemen, and then that kind of wider demographic of workers who migrate to Britain by choice to either rebuild the country, take up roles in specific industries, or, recruited from the Caribbean in some cases, or in most, just coming as economic migrants, seeking adventure, seeking better work, and more money, and to climb the social ladder, hoping to go back richer in 5 years or so, as the story goes. But this work focuses on the children as they move without agency, often being told it's what's best for them, but not necessarily understanding what that means, having to navigate not only a new country, but the rebuilding of relationships with parents who traveled ahead of them, the fracture in relationships with grandparents, aunties, and relatives that raised them back home in their home islands, that they have now left to build these lives in Britain as very young children. I picked to focus on Jamaica and St. Kitts in particular for 3 reasons. Most simply is because I use oral history and I needed to ensure that there were actually going to be people now 60 to 80 years old who made this trip that I could actually speak to and find out about their experiences. In Birmingham, the population of Jamaican people and people of Jamaican descent is extremely high, and it's a community that I'm very familiar with, being of that background myself. Catticians also make up quite a significant portion of people in Birmingham, which is something that I think I've definitely been validated in on this trip. When I'm here and people, hear the accent in St. Kitts, that is, and they say, "Oh, where are you from?" And I say England, they say, "Oh, Birmingham." And there's nowhere else in the world I've been where people guess Birmingham as the first choice. It's typically London. So I'm assuming most people here, as they've gone on to say, have family in Birmingham and know the city really well. So it's quite nice that I think it's worked out that I've been able to pick two islands that, well, 3, including Nevis, that tie in so well to this migration into Birmingham. Second reason that I picked them is because this work explores the foundation of the education system in the kind of bigger British West Indies. It's, I think, important to note that I believe anyway, the roots of education are tied into the period of enslavement and this abolition period, which, enslavement in reality was 1838, for many people after a period of apprenticeship. The wealth of the islands was directly impacting the provision of education after emancipation. St. Kitts, having a more volcanic and mountainous terrain with gentler mountain slopes, meant that it was in some ways suitable for the production of sugar, and the same with Nevis. Nevis was sometimes unviable for sugar, but there were still fortunes made. And it meant that St. Kitts and Nevis developed a real plantation and slavery system, which could be clearly identified, I think, post-emancipation. Jamaica, being a bigger island alongside islands like Barbados, were even bigger exporters of sugar in the region, sugar being one of the most labor-intensive crops, which led to a large number of enslaved Africans being trafficked to these islands to meet the demands for the crop. Consequently, making plantation owners a fortune, which led to a better provision of education post-emancipation than some of the smaller islands, I would argue, comparing a place like Jamaica to St. Kitts and Nevis, which had smaller enslaved populations and thus a lesser need for an extensive education provision. Thirdly, when it comes to exploring the colonial education system, its developments, its fluctuations, independence for these colonies and this period of nation building that both nations go through is extremely important as it influences changes on education policy. Jamaica gains its independence in August 1962, which means in the kind of wider story of migration and the migration of children, in line with the Immigration Act in Britain in 62, a lot of participants are migrating either just before that or quickly after to beat the bad. Which means their memories can speak to this shift from British colony to an independent nation and the impact that was having on their education. However, St. Kitts doesn't gain independence until 1983, which means everybody from St. Kitts that's migrating as a child is migrating from a British colony. And there's quite a nice comparison that can be done within people coming from Jamaica that is going through these changes, especially in the 50s and 60s, compared to a place like St. Kitts that, despite going through changes for the Federation and things like that, doesn't see that break from Britain until a little bit later. During enslavement, there was little or no access to education for the enslaved, even informally. Any education kind of given by a kind master was often seen as uncharacteristically generous, an exception, not typically the norm. And in this period, education in the colonies was typically for white children of the planter classes whose parents couldn't afford to send them back to Britain to be educated. So these less wealthy white families sent their sons to the few free schools that were established by wealthier planters and merchants in the colonies based on the English-style grammar system, and their ability to access them was determined and based on their race, gender, and their class as young children. That's kind of the way I've kind of developed this project, and this early chapter, which is what I'm sharing with you today in part, looks at this longer history of education in the British West Indies, focusing on the islands, obviously I've mentioned, but putting these two education systems, St. Kitts, Nevis, and Jamaica, into conversation with what's happening in Britain, because the Caribbean is going through attempts to unify through federation. It's going through a period of decolonization and nation building. And, you know, in the 1940s, post-war Britain is going through this extensive welfare package. The Butler Education Act of 1944 is bringing more people into education and gives a kind of promise to the nation that education is important and should not be, children shouldn't be barred from it based on wealth. It should be accessible to all that need it, and there should be a wide range of educational options, grammar schools, comprehensive schools, and technical schools. So at the turn of the 20th century, Millicent White argues that education was low on the list of priorities for colonial governments. Whilst it might have been low on the list, small changes were still occurring, especially in regards to the provision of secondary education. Colonial governments were slowly deciding on how to develop an elementary education into a secondary education, another step. In the 1920s, the imperial government began to focus on how to improve conditions in the colonies in order to set them up for self-dependence, or at the very least, appear to improve them. This would mean developing education in order to train local leaders to gradually take on more political responsibilities. And it was widely accepted that education was the best way to do this. Stanley A. Hammond, the senior education commissioner, came with ideas based on the more progressive philosophies of education that were developing in Europe and the US. These progressive philosophies centered on the idea of a more interactive approach to learning that was more beneficial than the common rote learning that was typically adopted. Secondly, that the primary role of education should be to train people to fit into the roles that their economy, has available. In this case of the West Indies, it meant that kind of shaping this philosophy of education should be to train these children for everyday rural life in order to improve material conditions, constant sentiment surrounding education during the 20th century. Despite the financial ability to offer said changes, during a period of economic decline, there was still a need and a desire for these changes to be made. During the 1930s, the colonial education system was in full swing. Curriculum-wise, the system still mirrored that of Britain's. In a publication in Trinidad, The People, it recorded the sentiment of an English traveller who travelled across the islands of the West Indies, including Jamaica, and regarding education, said this: "The children in the schools in all the islands thumb the same great primers as we have done in England, and know all about Alfred the Great and the cakes and how John lost his crown, and of the War of the Roses. They love the doings of our kings and queens, and though the children be of African origin, they are quite ready to talk of England as the homeland and the mother country. But unlike the English children, they love long words. You will often see a youngster poring over the words of a dictionary, sorting out those of largest size and memorizing them for future use. This traveller's comments highlight English attitudes towards the colonies, where they are somewhat amused by the fact that children are still forced to, and their system is providing an education that holds Britain at its core. Children ambitiously pursuing this love of long words. Interestingly, I think the kind of shock in his tone suggests that this Englishman maybe presumed that there would be a curriculum that was more focused on the West Indies, or at least in part a departure from Britain's, but clearly had Britain posed and in place as the mother country and the homeland for these children that could access this level of education. Another example of this Englishness that was steeped into kind of the West Indian education system comes from Mrs. Francis, who, funnily enough, recalled the day her music teacher in Jamaica, who was actually from Birmingham, she eventually migrated to Birmingham, hence our interview, asked why the class only sung English songs. She said, in Jamaica, we were singing Cherry Ripe, and Down by the Ash Grove. And he said, why aren't you singing the Jamaican songs? So he introduced us to that. I can still see us now singing, Carry Me Aki Down Linstead Market. I would sing the rest of it, but we'd be here all day. So it took a teacher, essentially, from Birmingham, as she said, Birmingham, England. He had come to Jamaica. He got us singing in Jamaican. But they said the school really was an English sort of school. Now, Mrs. Francis was born in 1951, and she was educated for the majority of her education in Jamaica. She attended Manning School in Savlamar, Westmoreland, Jamaica, which had offered classes since 1738. Manning's is the oldest continuous operating high school in Jamaica. The reaction from the English traveller and the English teacher illuminate this shock at what is being learned in the colonies, and illuminates also, I think, the lack of awareness that the English had of education in the West Indies, which is very much more apparent when I start, getting into the interviews with participants that moved to England and realize that this England that they're stepping into knows nothing of them, of people of the colonies. Whilst Mrs. Francis' recollections that I've used here come from her experiences of education in the 1950s, and the other traveller was from the 1930s, I think it highlights the persistence of this type of curriculum into the 20th century. So despite the kind of reservations towards its practicality in these rural islands from colonial administrators, in some parts of society, and this being a middle-class educational experience that Mrs. Francis was afforded, showing that this kind of education was still happening despite colonial authorities who thought that it wasn't suitable. So the shift to kind of investigate education in the British West Indies came largely from a shift in the imperial focus from conquest and toward the development of these colonial possessions. Ansborough Rush argues that the American value placed on the national self-determination during and after the First World War were really important in pushing this shift. In 1933, Frederick Marriott, who was Director of Education in Trinidad, 1926 to 1934, and Arthur Mayhew, Secretary to the Colonial Office's Advisory Committee in the 30s, published the Marriott-Mayhew report. Their investigations focusing on education in the Eastern Caribbean, which included St. Kitts and Nevis, but not Jamaica. They recommended a bigger focus on practical training and the West Indianizing at primary level. This meant establishing modern secondary schools that would replace the classical curriculum with subjects like domestic science, which they believed was more relevant to the Caribbean environment. West Indianizing or Caribbeanizing the curriculum in this context meant centering the local environment in the curriculum, including in literature, geography, and history, that centered the region, as opposed to focusing so heavily on Britain. The Marriott-Mayhew Review suggested history and geography, which were considered British in their nature, should be banished as separate subjects in primary schools, and there should be a focus on the local West Indian environment. However, the report did assure West Indians that any cultural learnings lost from a loss of these subjects would be made up for with English language lessons. So despite, conflicting sentiments and contradictions in many ways, it was clear that they were undergoing an attempt to West Indianize or Caribbeanize the curriculum in order to make it more relevant to society's needs and for the masses. In the 1930s, can't really talk about them in the Caribbean without thinking about the labor revolts, which marked, I'd say, a key moment in the development of society. Primarily, the revolts exposed the poor living conditions, unemployment, and underemployment of the working classes across the British West Indies. It uncovered an overall and increasing feeling of discontent, resentment, dissatisfaction of the working classes. Richard Hart notes that the first of these major disturbances came from the island of St. Kitts, an island that was still producing sugar. The sugar industry was the largest employer of labour on the island, hence the reliance on the industry. And it was clear that these feelings of discontent had been boiling since 1930 due to wage reductions in particular. By the 29th of January 1935, processions of workers across the sugar industry had downed tools and refused to work. And Howard Ferguson argues that there was a strong sense of social justice in St. Kitts, and I'd argue that I've found this to be the case being here and interviewing people here. And he speaks of this sense of social justice and egalitarianism beginning to emerge, and that's a direct quote, on the island a lot sooner than places like Jamaica. He notes that it's not surprising that the genesis of these uprisings in the 1930s were in St. Kitts as they propelled the working class movement across the region. The labour riots of the 1930s impact education because it led to the Moyne Report, a royal commission on the situation in the colonies that had specific recommendations regarding education. Whilst these debates on the curriculum are focused on the 30s, and the children within the scope of my research enter into the Caribbean education system in the 1950s and 60s, it can't be overstated, I think, how important the 30s are in regards to these debates and on the philosophy of education. The debates, especially regarding curriculum, continued into the 60s and 70s as the first two post-independent governments shaped the future of Jamaican society. The Moyne Report highlighted the fact that despite the clear developments needed within the education system, the lack of funding available for this work would be a hindrance. The report noted the disparate funding available across the islands when it came to education and the impact that it was all going to have on the provision of it. This was especially the case in the smaller and poorer islands. The idea that primary education should be compulsory was debated within the threads of the report. However, it was concluded that if this were to happen, the demand for the places would not be accommodated. So there was a sense that despite the fact that they might see it important to open up these spaces and have compulsory education, they didn't think the people would take up these spaces. It was also noted a lack of higher education or universities across the West Indies, which was then impacting post-secondary opportunities where secondary education was even available. Many students leaving on island scholarships to go to Britain or other kinds of scholarships funded in other ways and going to places in Canada and the US was very common at the time. The curriculum has been quite a contentious issue in regards to education since the late 19th century. And these debates definitely continued into the Moyne Report in the 40s because it was described that the curriculum was blindly copied by the British. And, you know, it was made worse by the fact that it was already being argued to be out of date by British standards, let alone then, you know, the Caribbean following behind that. Interestingly enough, the Commission also noted that when more progressive proposals had been made in Britain, they were also met with similar resistance. So, you know, again, another parallel between what's happening in the colonies and in Britain. The pushback was not just present in Britain, it was also present within the middle classes in the Caribbean, because they also felt like a British education was important, it was social capital, it was currency, and they didn't want the system to necessarily be Caribbeanized or West Indianized because that would potentially lessen this kind of capital that they would have and their children would be afforded through the education system. So there is quite a lot of debate going on between various sects of society and, you know, in parallel to what's happening in Britain at the time. So at this point, little had changed regarding, I would argue anyway, regarding beliefs about the changes to education. Debates were raging on. And despite agreement among colonial authorities regarding the curriculum, and, you know, I've said all that to say essentially, the bottom line was still money and finance. And every change, every advancement, every development required extra funding, and the imperial government had been somewhat unwilling to provide it until the disturbances of the 1930s, which is why they're so important. So despite the aims of colonial administrators, as I said, there was pushback from local educators and parents to a more practical curriculum that focused on the West Indian environment. And as the report put it, and I quote, West Indians have always looked to Britain for their model and have opposed any attempt to treat the West Indies differently from England, as designed to keep them in an inferior position. Elementary school teachers, end quote, elementary school teachers and administrators from the Caribbean expressed the belief that the purpose of schools was to develop the intellectual capacities of a child, not to train them for specific jobs. There were calls for more practical lessons on agriculture for the boys and domestic training, sewing and child welfare instruction for girls. The belief that junior secondary schools should be vocational schools and give training in practical subjects was also proposed. It was believed that at the same time, schools with literary curriculums should remain, but there would be another option. And that kind of was portrayed and understood as a good middle ground in this debate for post-primary education and what it should look like. A system that was likely to see poorer children going through the vocational education if they had any post-primary education at all, and children from wealthier families accessing this literary education, which they believed had higher social value and capital. Hammond's focus on the curricula of schools centered on the impact that it would have on future employment of the state and the economy regarding the workforce. He felt that the primary school curriculum was bookish with few books. The 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, were being drilled into children with little knowledge of how they actually might use them in the future. He argued that these secondary school requirements of English examination boards locked staff into teaching subjects that were going to be irrelevant for most children, such as Latin, Greek, and English literature. And they felt that there was no flexibility for teachers and schools to adapt to local needs, the local needs being by the nature rural and agricultural. The report argued that it was disparaging rural life and amplifying a town life, which many of them would never be able to live out due to the availability of jobs on the island. And the curriculum left them with more knowledge of other countries than their own because textbooks were focusing so much on English society and culture. In Jamaica in 1953, the Ministry of Education was founded alongside other ministries of government overseeing other sections of society. They were established in order to give the island gradual autonomy when it came to self-governance, and in 1958, secondary education is extended through the introduction of the Common Entrance Examination. The examination meant that children who were academically able to progress into secondary education were afforded the opportunity to win a full or half. This, for many parents, removed the financial barrier to further education. Mrs. Francis, who we spoke about earlier, benefited from a half scholarship to Manning's High School. The remainder of her fee was covered by her mother, who was now living and working in Britain and sending money back to support her daughter's education. An example of kind of one of the complications being made to CLACS at the time, because this education that would not have been afforded if her mother had stayed, being of the working classes, but due to this migration and the money that was being acquired by her mother in Britain, she was able to cover this half of the tuition, affording her, a very prestigious education. Mrs. Francis eventually retook the test actually and received a full scholarship. So, benefiting essentially from the best possible education based on her ability, and also supported by the fact that for the year where she hadn't and had the half scholarship, she had a parent that could pay in the meantime. In Jamaica, independence came in 1962, but it wasn't until the Education Act of 1965 that the statutory and operation elements of the system married up. Despite the global developments post-war and government changes, the system remained much like the parent British system to a large extent post-independence. Secondary education was still seen as quite limited in quantity and range, and primary education had been quite neglected. The Jamaican government's New Deal for Education in 1964 announced an £8 million spend for the development of education over the next 3 years. And the funds were split with around 7 million, so the large percentage of it going to build junior secondary schools, expand the facilities of teacher training, expand the College of the Arts, Science and Technology, and the Jamaica School for Agriculture. And 1 million of that, so the smaller part, being used to build up primary schools and teachers' cottages. So these aims would fit into this new philosophy that the best education that the country can afford must be open to every child, because all children are equally important and they shouldn't be hindered by the kind of financial limitations of their parents. The new philosophy, paired with financial injections into the education system on the island, was in theory what exactly was needed to push the system into this kind of more equitable position. Interestingly enough, the New Deal draws upon this colonial history of education in its pamphlet publication. It draws on the history of class hierarchy, whereby the ruling classes monopolized education, and it was noted that it was created for the elites and the planter classes to enjoy the benefits of an education. So it's clear that the philosophy of education, whilst it was shifting in the 60s, it still had an eye on what had happened and the kind of history of education on the island. Um, However, despite these shifts, how far were they going to actually change the reality in regards to education for children on the island? Progress, I would say, in this period still feels slow, and the problems that plagued the system in the early 20th century were still quite apparent. Much needed developments relied on funding, and whilst Jamaica was lent funds from the Canadian International Development Agency, the CIDA, and the World Bank in 1966 and 1970 to expand the provision of primary and secondary education. In Jamaica, the 5-year education plan, so 1978 to 1983, it's noted that the 50 years in that, it's noted that the 50 years prior, so from the 20s to the 70s, there had been little expansion, and that's a direct quote. The system had specific problems that had been there for a while. They primarily were a lack of qualified teachers, overcrowding in classrooms and schools, derelict buildings, so not a good enough provision of physical buildings, and inadequate support services. They note in particular the inaccessibility of education for the poorer classes, especially in the rural areas when it came to secondary education. It was noted to be much better in corporate areas like Kingston and St. Andrew, which created this second tier and another barrier for those who lived in more rural areas. This new philosophy for education that I would argue came in around 1967 centered on the idea that opportunities for the best education were the fact that it would be for everybody despite their socioeconomic status, still hadn't really in truth come to fruition. This move to destroy the class system of the colonial era, whereby education was provided for the less privileged and thus was of a lower standard, would only be achieved with higher levels and take up of teacher training and graduate opportunities. Expansions that fit the aims of the nation's philosophy for education were only possible through financial backing, and developments made in the 1960s were evidence of that. As I mentioned, some of the funding bodies earlier, in 1966, with assistance from the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, a plan for education all the way up to 1980 was proposed in the New Deal for Education. The main focus of that plan was to develop post-primary offerings, both in the amount of places available to take on post-primary education and the quality of those offerings. Additionally, the plan looked at providing a school place for every student at primary age, and this was supported by the CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, who supported the building of 40 primary schools that could accommodate for 16,800 student places. The World Bank's loan in 66 supported the expansion of education in grades 7, 8, and 9. This was done by 50 schools, and that would accommodate 37,530 students. And another World Bank loan in 1970 funded the building of 12 new schools to accommodate just under 7,000 additional students in grades 7 to 11. The government of Jamaica also funded developments in the provision of secondary education, and these developments continued across the 1960s under the first independent government of Jamaica. The elections of February 1972 led to the first change in government since independence, and the People's National Party took power from the Jamaica Labour Party, and they continued to put education at the forefront of their plans. Michael Manley's government identified education as being continued support for its development. However, their focus extended to look at providing a better and substantial flow through of students, not just into secondary education, but also into higher education. The issues that plagued the education system in the 19th century didn't just retreat as the 20th century developed, and the islands worked towards self-governance. As the philosophy of education shifted towards a more equitable system, removing the needs of class and centering instead ability and talent, the issues of the past still remained, I would argue. And I think the fact that the debates were so long in the process and in conversation over this period of the 20th century, I think highlights that quite clearly. Teachers' qualifications and lack thereof in some parts of Jamaica were a pressing issue in the education system. The demand for education was surpassing now the supply of available teachers. Unfortunately, whilst governments and people were definitely clear that they wanted more education, the growth of it couldn't match the training of the teachers. And so the opportunity cost, especially for those that might train to be teachers, and the cost of them attending a training college as opposed to working was becoming quite unaffordable. And so this impact, I think, is best understood with some Ministry of Education figures for the mid-70s, 1974 to 1975 school year, which it shows the kinds of teachers and the qualifications they had, and where they were typically being taught, where they were typically teaching, sorry. So this lack of training available for teachers impacted primary school children the most. So these students made up the majority of children accessing education at any one time, but they were being educated by teachers with the lowest level of training on average. So in that 1974 to 1975 school year, 91% of teachers were pre-trained interns or pensioners. And they were the ones teaching the primary school children. 9% of those teachers, the pre-trained interns and pensioners, were teaching in secondary schools. But then on the kind of opposing side of that, of the 65%, of trained teachers and specialists, so that kind of tier of qualification were teaching in primary schools, and then 25% in new secondary schools and 10% in high schools. And then graduate teachers, of which there was a much smaller pot to draw from, 94% of them were in high schools, and 6% were in new secondary schools, and less than 1% of those were in primary schools. So as you kind of go ranks of qualification and certification that a teacher might have, they were more so based in the secondary schools and the high schools, as opposed to teaching in the primary schools. And in a society where the majority of students are accessing primary education, and in some cases that being their only form of education, it showed the quality and standard of teaching that they were getting at that level. Essentially, whilst the class system was, there was an attempt to break it down, in some cases it was still having an impact, and it was something that would be very difficult to break down in the period of time and without the available funding. Another issue was the lack of available school places within the system. This could occur due to lack of physical space, as well as low staff levels. And parents were keen on their children accessing education, as I've said, especially at primary level. Sometimes they were unable to find places in their local elementary schools. Towards the start of this 1967 and 68 school year, I found quite an interesting article in the Jamaica Gleaner about parents from Trenchtown protesting directly to the Ministry of Education due to the lack of school spaces. The Gleaner reported that the reason the children were being turned away is because despite the fact that there were classrooms with desks, benches, and seats available, there were no teachers to teach them, or not enough. One parent revealed in the article that her daughter had been turned away after attending school for the first 2 days with no issue. However, on the third day, they were sent home with a message from the teacher saying that there was no space and they couldn't continue. This kind of, I guess, is a good way of highlighting some of the problems with a lack of teachers, despite then having the space. And also the importance of education to these Trenchtown parents who marched to the Ministry of Education to fix this problem and ensure that their children would be able to go to a school, that was local to them, and somewhere that there would be teachers and space for them. I think that it highlights, just how important education was to them, but also kind of speaks to the idea that them being able to travel to the Ministry of Education, and the fact that they're from within that area, be able to make things known to the Ministry of Education. How would parents in more rural areas on the islands do the same if the child faced the same predicament? Would they be able to access that? Conditions of buildings and equipment is something that is an issue into the 60s and 70s, before these injections of funding from these international bodies. And interestingly, with participants I've interviewed, they noted and remembered being educated in big kind of open hall type spaces with big blackboards that would separate, a large room into classrooms. They also reported being sometimes taught outside, which for a young child in the Caribbean, they don't, report that back to me as it being a problem. They speak of it as, being a fond memory of being able to be outside, being educated amongst their friends in the kind of their home islands. But the lack of space, lack of equipment, tables, chairs, textbooks, teaching aids, libraries, and other necessary resources definitely had an impact on the overall attainment of the students. So to somewhat conclude, I started with this quote, "Many see the problem, only someone changes," and it was from John Horton, who was a teacher from 1974 and part of the Jamaica Teachers Association. And in this pamphlet, he pointed out the fact that it was clear, that there is a problem with education and it needs to be fixed, but it was not everybody that wanted these changes. It spoke to this problem with the kind of more wealthier elite people in society that were reluctant to see these changes as it might impact the privilege which they have enjoyed, over the past years. However, education did develop, and it was clear it needed the financial injections as well as the desire for, these problems to be fixed. The period of the 1960s in Jamaica shifts this kind of philosophy of education to educate a wider section of society and enable the children who are adept and talented and able to go into further education and not be held back by cost. As I said, it forms a parallel in many ways to the developments in Britain's education system in the 40s, highlighting a promise to parents and wider society after the kind of grueling time that was World War II, that education should be A, for all, and B, varied to provide options for all types of children with more academically minded needs or more vocationally suited. Despite the similarities in these systems and some of the parallels that I could draw on in Britain, those children that then did migrate into British schools, especially from schools like the Mannings, and those that had a more English curriculum based on the grammar system, they still felt when they got to Britain that very little was understood about the system that they had come from. And even though the system was so familiar and so samely in a sense, and some would even argue that they felt like they were further ahead in the Caribbean than they were when they got to Britain, it's clear that the perceptions that were still about regarding education in the Caribbean were not necessarily matching up for the experiences of all children. And there was a wide spectrum of experiences, being accessing education during this period in the Caribbean. think I will leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. And as I said, this is something I'm kind of thinking through and working on. So any comments, questions, thoughts, feelings, I'd be very grateful for them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deanna. That was actually spot on, perfect timing. So thanks so much. And thanks for such an insightful presentation. Really interesting. And on a topic I thought I knew a lot about, but I didn't. So thanks so much. We're going to open the floor for questions. So feel free to either raise your hand, put your camera on and ask the question, or you can type it in the chat and I'm happy to ask the question for you. But just to note, we are being recorded. So if you don't want your face on camera, then it would be best to type the question into the chat. So yeah, feel free to ask. Karen?
Hello, thank you, Deanna. That was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed that talk. I'm studying public history at UCL as a master's, and it's just fascinating that I've been taking the oral history module this term, and I decided to interview my aunt, who is in her 70s, who did travel from Jamaica in the 60s and had her education partly there on a half scholarship, and came here into the secondary modern system. So it's exactly what you're saying, came to a level of which completely different level of education, which affected her life chances dramatically. And I was just wondering how much of your work is about the sort of comparison, within individual people, a comparison of their system there and the system here, and how that affected what they were doing, because that's what I'm going through with my aunt at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for your question. That work sounds really, really interesting. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. It's easy for individual people to do the kind of direct comparison, which is why I wanted to focus on people doing this migration as opposed to, Black British born Caribbean children, and maybe comparing their experiences to those that stayed in the Caribbean. But there's a lot. There's those children that had very little formal education in the Caribbean and were in rural areas and weren't able to access any kind of formal education, and then come to Britain and kind of have to struggle on the back foot. But I think the more common story has been the one where they've had quite a good education in Britain, because all but one of my participants' parents went ahead. So parents are going ahead, sending back money. They're sending back barrels, as they're kind of known as barrel children. And so they're able to access better education than they would have done if they had, their parents had stayed. And so, like Mrs. Francis, an example of being at Manning School, she just has this like love of knowledge and books, and she's reading Shakespeare at a young age and Wordsworth, and she gets to England and they're kind of handing her kind of lower level books and putting her in a comprehensive school, and she's explaining that, oh well, I've here and not offering those opportunities to them. So it's definitely did I cut out? So, yeah, I had it.
Just about 5 seconds.
Okay, I think I was talking about Mrs. Francis being in a grammar school, and then not being able to go to a grammar school when she comes to this country initially. I think eventually her parents advocated for her and really fought, and she was able to go to one. But I had other examples of participants from St. Kitts, again in grammar schools here, and then going there and then being like, absolutely not, and not putting them through for any kind of examinations or anything like that. So there's definitely, and I get into that in the later chapters. I will not underplay the racism that they're being met with, the discrimination, and that is absolutely hampering their academic attainment and abilities. And what struck me is, and I'm very aware of the fact that I think a lot of people that I'm interviewing will only sit and talk with me because they feel like they've been successful despite their education system. So I'm talking to people that have gone on to do, teachers, nurses, doctors. They've gone into these roles and professions that they feel are a success, and they feel that, the migration their parents made and the sacrifices they made have been worth it. But they say that despite of the education system in Britain, they say that what was instilled in them in the Caribbean and this love of education and this, value that it had teamed with night school in Britain as adults, because that's what they then had to go for to be able to step into these roles, has definitely been the reason why they are in this successful place. I've been interested, and I've been thinking about, you know, the fact that then my pool feels skewed, because it is people that then can say I'm successful because of, or despite of. I wonder what, you know, my work would look like if I was talking to people that, you know, these disadvantages and the discrimination they faced had actually really seriously hampered their experiences, and they weren't in the jobs that, you know, are good and socially climbing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, I can see somebody has put in the chat. So Liz said that she's curious about the photographs you included in the presentation. What was the context in which they were produced, and are you incorporating them into your methodology at all?
Oh, sorry. I just went to check my source, but I've lost my Zoom. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Liz. Thanks for the question. So they're from one of the pamphlets, the New Deal of Education pamphlet in 1964. And I've definitely taken them out of context using them today. But some of them are the older classrooms in primary education, and then the kind of aim of what they wanted the new ones to look like. But I just, for the sake of the presentation, I just wanted some pictures that represented education in Jamaica. I'm not using photography or like pictures in my methodology at all, actually. I haven't really thought about it, actually. I haven't thought about doing it. I didn't also know what kind of pictures were available until I went to Jamaica last year, and in the University of the West Indies library, they had all these pamphlets on education, and not all of them have pictures in, but this one in particular did. And just kind of, I guess they were very clear about visualizing what they wanted education to look like and where they were currently at. And it is a great like tool for me now to kind of understand the system and what was happening.
Thanks so much. Any additional questions? Feel free to either put them in the chat or just unmute yourself. Eve has also been updating the chat with some links to different things as well.
I have a question.
Great, thanks, Eve.
I just wondered, well, before we got started, Deanna, we were having a chat about you being in St. Kitts at the moment, so I thought that's quite a nice thing to share with the group. So I just wondered, you were talking about that you were doing interviews and archival research. So just talk us through a little bit about what you've been doing the past 2 weeks and kind of how that's informing the broader project.
Absolutely. Thank you. So essentially mirroring kind of what I'd done in Jamaica, to be able to write this chapter, I needed more information on the education policy in the region, and how it was developing and shaping and why. So archivally, I've been at the archives are in the government building, which feels really cool, because you're in the government building, going through old documents. But I found that the newspapers actually have been really useful. The St. Kitts Nevis Bulletin and the Union Messenger, I think it's called. And I've been through those papers over 20 years, so from the early 40s to the late 60s. And it's interesting how education is being reported on. The Bulletin will post full government kind of memos and documents for people. But it's also interesting the way that people are really clearly interested in education and interested in the changes. And something in particular that I've been thinking about a lot, which I didn't speak about in this paper, sorry. I think that they've come back to work after construction. So apologies if you can't hear me. But the thing that has been interesting to me that I didn't speak about in this paper has been federation. And the way that federation is developing in the 1950s, obviously not working out beyond 62, but the impact that will have on education and a kind of promise of that, and the way that's being reported in the papers. And the bulletin is quite a nice paper because it also brings articles from other papers across the Caribbean. So I'm getting news from other places like Antigua and Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica, all in this kind of one publication. So that's been my focus. I've also been able to interview people that went to school in St. Kitts in the 40s, 50s, 60s, just to kind of, not necessarily even to use within this work because they didn't do the migration themselves, but actually just to kind of understand the system, understand the kind of things that they were learning and seeing if that's matching up to what is, you know, the government policy at the time and colonial policy at the time.
Thanks. And we can hear you despite the construction. It was all fine.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I'm not sure if anybody's got an additional question, but I wanted to just ask a bit, if you could tell us a bit more about the kind of differences and similarities between education in Jamaica and St. Kitts, if possible, because I know you said that you spoke to some people who had gone to school in St. Kitts. So I was just wondering.
I think I still feel like I have more things to read, especially with St. Kitts. But I think similarities, I think there is still this like belief that, and I think it comes from this kind of period of enslavement where education is something that was deserved for them. It's something that was withheld from them during this period. And I think that people see it as something that's really important, is a key to their success, a key to their social mobility, and the kind of key to unlock this kind of world of opportunities. And that I think runs true. I would go as far as saying across the Caribbean. I think it's really, really important to people at this time. I think in terms of differences, I think because of the size, obviously the size difference of Jamaica compared to St. Kitts, just the way that things develop. I think it's obviously with a smaller population, it's easy to put something in place and it happen a little bit quicker. Whereas in Jamaica, there seems to be a lot more conversation about things before things kind of take off a lot of the time. And then, as I said before, in 1962, obviously Jamaica are independent and so completely break away in many ways from the British, whereas St. Kitts, Nevis, and then Anguilla, before they break off, are not independent till 1983. So there's still this kind of British, not rule, because they're given a lot more in terms of self-governance by then. They're not, completely dependent. But I think there's still more of a hand there, which I think is quite notable.
Thanks so much. Are there any additional questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask, or pop it in the chat if you do.
I mean, I had just another question actually, just on that in terms of the years of independence and also nation building, kind of the concept of nation building in terms of Caribbean identity and British identity, and particularly how that kind of obviously, if you know about my research, I'm interested in the Windrush scandal and kind of how that ties into people's perceptions of their own sense of belonging and Britishness. And what we found on that project was that people from St. Kitts, obviously because they became independent far later, obviously people from Jamaica were overwhelmingly affected by that, and a lot of that had to do with kind of this time scale and time of independence. So I just wondered if that came up at all in any of your discussions, if people kind of compared if they talked about kind of their own understandings of their construct of Britishness, and if that ever fed into the curriculum at all, or in terms of kind of the education and what they were learning in the classroom. I'm not sure if that makes a lot of sense, but
no, thank you. I think it's an interesting point and definitely can say something towards that. I think in interviews, people they haven't really compared, I think, to other islands. I think it speaks to kind of the idea that when they get to Britain, they're West Indian or they're Caribbean. Before that, you're just from St. Anne's in Jamaica or wherever else, that this kind of bigger identity comes then. I think in terms of identity, and I deliberately haven't gone into it too much because I think that could be a thesis in itself. I've found that the most kind of common conversations I've had around it have been the fact that children coming over in this time are not necessarily identifying as British in the same way that the parents in this so-called Windrush generation identify as. They're, I think, aware that, you know, they refer to themselves as Jamaican or Catition, and they've just moved at a young age. And I think there's a difference between them and then the British-born Caribbean children who they aren't necessarily getting on with either. There's comments, a lot of the time comments made about their accents when they arrive, because those born here might have a more of an English sounding accent. And so I think those have been the more of the things I've thought of and have been spoken about when it comes to identity. But in terms of comparing kind of island to island, I think if that's what you were asking, I haven't really noticed that as much. I think I have one participant that remembers Jamaica gaining independence at school and the kind of new flag being developed and singing the new anthem and that kind of thing. And that was a really, really cool interview to do, because as much as you kind of read about it in the papers of you know, Princess Margaret visiting and all that, to actually hear it from her perspective as like a 9-year-old and what that meant to her was really interesting.
Thanks, Deanna. It's similar. I interviewed, for my fieldwork, I interviewed someone in Barbados who was there for the Bajan independence, and they had the flag and everything, and they were saying, I felt I was always Bajan, and they didn't even have a concept of being West Indian or Caribbean until they moved to the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
a really interesting kind of concept. I think we've got another question in the chat from Amy, who asks, she said, thank you so much for such a wonderful paper. She's interested in the ideas about protests that you mentioned that appeared in the archival newspaper. Are connections between education and protest a theme you explore more widely in this paper or your PhD? And is it something that appeared in both the Caribbean and Britain?
Thank you, Amy. I really like that question. So my final chapter, chapter 6, is about resistance to discrimination within education in Britain. So I look at the way in which parents are mobilising in Birmingham in particular, in different ways, either with supplementary schools or creating literature and children's books that actually present Black children and Black characters in a more uplifting light, as opposed to using racial stereotypes. And that's something I do in the final chapter, not completely fleshed out yet. But it's interesting. I've never made the parallel between the protest in Trenchtown, and actually that's a really good and interesting point of comparison, because it's clear then, and I think this is what underscores my bigger argument, is that education, as I've said so many times today, is just so important to people in the Caribbean. They really do see it as something that is a tool, and it's key for their development. And so actually maybe that Trenchtown section might be brought to chapter 6, and I can weave the two in together, actually, because there are definitely parallels of people really fighting for the education that they believe their children deserve, and they have a right to have. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? So in that case then, on behalf of everyone here, Deanna, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really insightful, and yeah, very late. Oh, someone just said it was a very late area of research, that they really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you so